Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
It's time for the Vote-a-rama on President Trump's big, beautiful bill. Welcome to the Monday edition, the early edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio, with an hours-long amendment session now getting underway in the United States Senate, expected to lead to a full floor vote by the time this is all done. Alongside Kailey Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We thank you for joining us here on Balance of Power. And it looks like we will see some action here in the hours ahead, Kailey. The question is when this gets to a full floor vote. That could be in the wee hours.
Yeah, this could take a while, as there are unlimited amendments that can be introduced and voted on. Of course, there's a few we're watching, like Rick Scott's amendment that would take down the federal cost sharing for Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. Susan Collins has one that would actually raise taxes on people making over $25 million in order to provide more funding to rural hospitals. Unclear whether or not any of these amendments actually have the votes to pass, but it's also not clear that without those amendments, that this bill in its entirety has the ability to pass on the Senate floor, where only 3 votes can be lost for Republicans.
We know we have a couple of no's already in Tom Tillis and Rand Paul. But then, of course, if that happens, if they do find a way to thread the needle past this in the Senate, Kailey, there are big questions about what happens when it goes back to the House. Will they simply vote on this product or try to change it? Because that would make things pretty messy. Wall Street is watching all of this, of course. Doesn't seem to be concerned at all. Much like the administration, they see all this as noise. Just get it to the president's desk before the 4th of July.
Yeah, and the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent maintained on Bloomberg TV and radio earlier today that this will happen by the 4th. But that is not a foregone conclusion. So we'll be tracking it for you this hour. But of course, as Joe mentions, the market's tracking this story as well. So let's get a check on those now. Charlie Pellet has a view from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. And here's what's going on. You're watching the tax bill. I'm watching what's going on Wall Street with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. Could see another record 3 hours from now as we wrap up the quarter. Right to the numbers. S&P up 17, up by 0.3%. Stocks ending the quarter at records, driven by progress in trade talks and hopes for Federal Reserve rate cuts. The Dow up 172, up 0.4. NASDAQ up 55, up 0.3. Again, keeping it all in context. S&P up by another 0.3%. Interestingly, though, on an up day when we are looking at a lot of green, red for the Bloomberg Mag 7 index, down now by 0.2%. The 10-year 4.24%, the 2-year 3.72%. Spot gold higher by $23 the ounce, up 0.7%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 42 cents a barrel, just above 65 right now. WTI down 0.6%, and Bitcoin up 0.2%, 107,654 on Bitcoin. Monday deals, we have got Home Depot buying specialty building products distributor GMS in a transaction valued at about $4.3 billion. Home Depot down 0.6%. Rival Lowe's trading lower by 1.4%, but GMS now surging by 11.8%. Balance of Power continues, and back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Financial markets active on this Monday, and it's an active Monday, of course, in Washington. It's going to be a very long Monday if you're a member of the United States Senate after the Vote-a-rama kicked off this morning, after it took some arm wrestling to actually get the requisite votes to proceed to this step over the weekend in the Senate. But amendment votes are coming up. They're coming up quickly. Unclear which ones will pass, but of course they need to get through this process in order to get to a vote on final passage for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which as of right now, Joe, has about 8 Republican senators who are uncommitted to voting yes.
Yeah, that is not workable if that's the case when this gets to the floor, which is also partly why we don't know exactly when that's going to happen. It could be this evening. It could bleed into tomorrow morning, depending on the status of this debate and the amendments that are coming. Tyler Kendall is watching all of this for us from Capitol Hill right now with the Vote-a-rama underway. Tyler, what's the latest on the timeline?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, it's bustling here on Capitol Hill since the Senate is in full swing amidst this Vote-a-rama. And really what we're seeing is behind the scenes, Senate Majority Leader John Thune is trying to make some deals and thread that needle because at the moment he doesn't have enough votes to pass this bill. Now, as you both outlined at the top there, this Vote-a-rama means that we're going to see a flurry of amendments from Democrats, but also some key Republicans that we're watching closely. And it sort of serves multiple purposes. One, to put their colleagues on the record on some politically fraught issues. news. 2, for Democrats at least to slow down this timeline. And 3, to maybe make some changes at the end of the day to this reconciliation package in these final hours. Now, we need this Vote-a-rama to end in order for them to proceed to the vote on final passage. And at the moment, we're looking into this kicking into at least late evening or even potentially early tomorrow morning, because at the end of the day, there's still 2 really competing factions within the Republican Party when it comes to the Senate side that's prohibiting this bill from getting over the finish line. We should say that most members agree on those core tenets, those core pillars when it comes to the tax cuts, for example, but they're pretty divided over the spending cuts. We know of at least 2 likely no's. One, Senator Thom Tillis, who's raised concerns about changes to Medicaid and the rollback of those clean energy tax credits. And the other side is Senator Rand Paul, who says he won't vote for any legislation that hikes the debt ceiling and he wants to see deeper spending cuts. And Joe and Kailey, that really illustrates the problem at hand, because if that's already 2, Senate Majority Leader John Thune can only afford to lose 1 more vote before he has to call up the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and have him come to Capitol Hill to cast a tiebreaker.
Yeah, and of course, for Senator Tillis in particular, he doesn't really have much to lose politically now that he made the surprise announcement over the weekend that he is not going to be seeking re-election in 2026. But Tyler, to your point about spending cuts, walk us through the actual math on this Senate-produced package. Now, with the estimates we've gotten from the Congressional Budget Office, but knowing that the Senate did vote, one of the first things that happened today, voted to use the current policy baseline to get fancy with the accounting to make it seem like the number's not quite so high.
Right, exactly. And we should say that this is actually the first time that we've seen this done during a reconciliation process, with Republicans essentially saying that extending the 2017 tax cuts is going to cost nothing. We heard from the Senate Budget Chair Lindsey Graham saying that the way an extension of a tax cut doesn't add to a budget deficit in the same way that a new tax cut would. And when we break down the math, it makes a pretty significant difference. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the current iteration of the Senate plan would add $3.3 trillion to deficits over a decade. That's about $4.5 trillion in projected tax cuts, paired with $1.2 trillion in projected spending cuts. But when you take into account this accounting mechanism, the CBO says that it would actually decrease budget deficits by $508 billion. So this could be seen as a way to get some of those Republicans who are pitching themselves as fiscal hawks on board, although we do know, as we're hearing on the Senate side, but also we're going to watch closely the House side, those House Freedom Caucus members, that they want to see some firmer commitments, at least from this administration, that there's more spending cuts or revenue raisers down the line.
An important reminder that getting through the Senate is just one step in this uphill climb. You still got to have it repass the House. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live from Capitol Hill for us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. And as we were just talking about the actual numbers here and the deficit impact, that's something that our colleague Sonali Basak had the chance to catch up with Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, about earlier today on Bloomberg. Asked him about the deficit and some other areas as well, like the chair of the Federal Reserve and those interest costs. Take a listen.
How does your math square with the CBO, with Wharton, with Yale, and even the Bloomberg consensus of GDP projectors here, economists, that still see growth under 2%?
Well, I think that's just wrong. And, we can start with the CBO. Is their model presumes 1.8% forever. And maybe under Democratic governments, that's right. I think what we saw under President Trump's first term is that we will get a big boost in the economy from the tax bill. We're going to have certainty. We're going to go back to 100% expensing. So we are also deregulating at the same time. So we saw it in Trump 1.0. I think that we can see it here. So I think we can really accelerate the economy, because the CBO model shows 1.8% growth, whether we have the biggest tax cut in history or we get this across the line and give companies and consumers great certainty.
You mentioned that the spending cuts were just a start. Now, which will prevail when you think about the cuts specifically as it pertains to Medicaid? Will the House level of cuts to Medicaid prevail, or the Senate level? And which one will the president support?
We'll see. My sense is, and again, I take exception to cuts. We are actually bending the curve further out. We are getting able-bodied people back to work, and the most needy will have greater benefits.
Well, the main question, too, is the benefits that are being cut. What do you tell the nearly 12 million people that are on the brink of losing access to Medicaid?
Well, no, again, that's not right. 1.4 million are illegal aliens. Then a huge percent of that are the able-bodied working people who will need to go back to work. So we're going to have a work requirement, and we'll go from there. We're just going back to the levels pre-COVID.
So given where the bill is, how does the latest bill impact the trajectory of the debt and deficit in your view?
Well, again, that I think as we accelerate growth, an increased growth trajectory completely changes the debt dynamics. So what we're focusing on is the debt to GDP. We're going to start bringing that back down. We are going to pull down the deficit to GDP. And I think we will be turning both of those down over the next year.
Does it give you, though, enough confidence to start terming out the debt? At what point do you start issuing at longer dated maturities?
Well, why would we do it at these rates? We are more than one standard deviation above the long-term. We're more than one standard deviation above the long-term rate, so why would we do that? The time to have done that would have been in 2021, 22.
So a lot of people in the market point out to the success that has been in the bond market. You have seen the 10-year come down almost 0.5 percentage point since the January highs. Where would you like to see the 10-year, and where do you think it could end by the end of the year?
Well, I think it's going to depend on a lot of things, but I think that we could see a further lowering of rates. I think inflation is very, very tame. I'm not going to comment on Fed policy, but I've said that I am focusing on the 10-year. So as we see inflation come down, I think the whole curve could parallel shift down. And I'll point out, when everyone says, oh, the market, the bond market's worried about this or that in the U.S. U.S. is the only major bond market that has lower 10-year rates than any other country. Every other country, the rates are up.
While we're talking about interest rates and the Federal Reserve, it has been recently reported that you might be in consideration for the job as the next Fed chair. When you've been asked about the likelihood recently, you said that it's up to the president. Is it a job that you would want?
I will do what the president wants, but I think I have the best job in D.C. We're making a lot of progress with the president's leadership. Think about it. We are going to have the tax bill on his desk by July 4th. We're going to be wrapping up the trade talks. So I think we've had great momentum, and we will be working on Chair Powell's successor over the coming weeks and months.
Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, talking with Bloomberg's Sonali Basak in a wide-ranging conversation there that brings us to the most recent truth post from Donald Trump. Interesting with this idea of replacing the Fed chair. Donald Trump just posted a moment ago, Jerome Too Late Powell and his entire board, which I think is new level here, should be ashamed of themselves for allowing this to happen to the United States. They have one of the easiest yet most prestigious jobs in America, and they have failed, in all caps, and continue to do so. He writes, if they were doing their job properly, our country would be saving tens of trillions on interest cost, rather. The board just sits there and watches, he writes, Kailey. So they are equally to blame. We should be paying 1% interest or better. So apparently the president's calling for the firing of the entire board. And this is attached with a handwritten note to Jerome in the Sharpie. You are, as usual, too late. You have cost the USA a fortune, he writes.
Yeah, it's actually some kind of visual aid to go alongside this True Social post of global world central bank rates. And he has a bracket and I would encourage everyone to go on True Social and view this yourself, of where he thinks the rate should be, beginning with Switzerland, which is at 25 basis points, down to the Seychelles and Thailand, which have a rate of 1.75%. So somewhere in that range, I guess, is what the President of the United States is looking for. At the very end of his note to Chairman Powell, that again is sharpied on to this particular chart of rates, he says no inflation, and then signs it Donald J. Trump.
He's the highlighter with the United States down through Vietnam. This is where we should not be, I guess. This is really something. We'll print this out for you, maybe. Dan Flatley's got to be looking at this as well. He joins us now, of course, Bloomberg Treasury reporter. You didn't know we'd have props today, Dan. I'm sorry if we snuck up on you with this, calling for the entire board to be replaced now. Is that something we're going to see happen?
Yeah, it's interesting, Joe, because Secretary Bessent was on Bloomberg TV this morning talking about how they may be looking at somebody who's already on the board for the chairmanship.
So now they're all fired.
So, it does sort of like things are constantly in motion in the Trump administration. And so, what we heard from Secretary Bessent this morning would seem to indicate that there may be some folks on the board right now that they're looking at, that Trump is interested in. But now we have this Truth Social post that would seem to indicate otherwise, that maybe he's dissatisfied with any of the candidates that could be there. So we'll see. I think what Bessent has said, though, is that they're going to start the process. They're looking at folks, and that sometime in October or November we'll get a nomination potentially for the seat that opens in January, which would be a 14-year seat, or maybe something later on for to replace Powell, which would be a 2-year term. Lots of different scenarios out there, and as it always is with President Trump, you never really know what the actual scenario will be until it's announced. So,
well, we know that his particular gripe at this point seems to be the interest burden of the United States. That's why he wants rates lower, is because of how much we have to pay to essentially keep financing our debt, at the very same time that he is pressuring Republicans to pass legislation that could add to the debt and deficit of the United States. How did we hear Bessent trying to square that, and does that actually track with the way that modern fiscal thinking tends to work? Yeah,
I mean, it's an interesting. There's a few different things to kind of pick apart there. One of the things that I would say is that as I've been talking to folks about this whole scenario over the last few weeks, there are people out there who say, yeah, it makes sense that Trump would want lower interest rates. It helps his agenda. There's really no, although his methods are unconventional, there's really no reason why he wouldn't have that view. But there is kind of this question of inflation expectations and sort of what damage this could do to the Fed's credibility over the long term, and its ability to fight inflation, which is potentially a bigger risk long term. What Bessent has said, and what he said this morning, again, was essentially that we will have growth, which will help stimulate the economy coming out of this tax bill, but also that he's focused on the 10-year, bringing the yields down on that, and that inflation, the main thing is that any increase in inflation from tariffs would be, he didn't use the word transitory, but essentially would be a one-time price increase that the Fed should look through and not get too hung up on that. That's not what we're hearing from some members of the board who believe that it could be more incremental, could have more of a persistent effect. So, difference of opinion.
Yeah, we've got less than a minute to end. To what extent, and it seems like a pretty great one, has this Treasury Secretary been instrumental in helping to craft the deals that are going to lead to this bill passing? He had the SALT caucus in his office last week. It's not the last meeting I'm sure he'll be having with lawmakers.
Yeah, obviously there's lots of meetings happening between folks at Treasury, including the Secretary and lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Let's not forget also the Section 899, the so-called revenge tax that came out of the bill last week. Also this deal with Canada. So there's lots of things that are happening both here domestically and internationally.
With his fingerprints on them. Yeah. Dan, thank you so much. Dan Flatley, Bloomberg U.S. Treasury reporter, with us live here in Washington. Kailey will assemble our panel next. Jeanne, Zaino, and Lisa Camooso Miller are with us as we follow the tea leaves here in the midst of a daytime Vote-a-rama. What could go wrong? This is Bloomberg. And make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. Go to Apple or Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, and subscribe. This will be a fun one to listen back to. You can listen live always at Bloomberg.com.
here in Washington. It's Vote-a-rama Day in the United States Senate. It began this morning, and it could go well into the late hours tonight, if not the early hours of tomorrow, with amendment votes on the Senate floor on this one big, beautiful bill, knowing that there are still roughly 8 Republican senators who haven't said their firm yeses on this legislation as it stands right now. And the majority leader, John Thune, can only afford to lose 3 of them, ultimately, in a final passage vote. He already definitely doesn't have 2, one being Senator Rand Paul, who, of course, will not vote for this package because it includes a hike to the debt ceiling. Another being Republican Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina, who made the surprise announcement over the weekend that not only will he not support this bill, he's also not going to seek re-election in 2026. And he had some pretty harsh words on the floor.
I'm telling the president that you have been misinformed. You supporting the Senate Marc will hurt people who are eligible and qualified for Medicaid. We're going to make sure that we fulfill the promise, and then I can feel good about a bill that I'm willing to vote for. But until that time, I will be withholding my vote.
With the bolo tie on the floor of the United States Senate, Kailey, the Cook Political Report has already flipped its analysis of this Senate seat to toss-up in the wake of his departure, and the name game has already started. Laura Trump is back in the mix, along with others here. Of course, Roy Cooper among Democrats, and there are several already running in that race. But we want to get back to the matter at hand here. Call Thom Tillis a profile in courage, or what's wrong with Washington. Either way, these senators are going to have to make a decision here in the coming hours on what to do with this bill, and that's where we start with our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeanne Zaino is with us, senior democracy fellow with the Study for the Presidency in Congress, and Republican strategist Lisa Camooso Miller, former RNC communications director, a veteran of another Republican speaker's office. Lisa, I'll start with you on what you think is about to happen here, beginning with a daytime Vote-a-rama. What the heck's going on here? This is usually what takes place in the overnight hours. You hear crazy stories about pizza and wine being delivered at 2 a.m., but we're doing it at high noon, presumably to give these lawmakers a chance to stay up all night again. What do you make of this decision?
Well, Joe, these are sort of the theatrics and the way that this typically goes down at a bill like this that is so contentious. But it also gives a tremendous amount of wiggle room and time for the majority leader to go ahead and try to get those 8 that are on the bubble back in the fold. And so certainly, like you said, there's 2 that are for sure not going to be with the majority on this bill. There's still so much to wait and see. So Vote-a-rama is an opportunity for, lots of votes on lots of amendments and lots of nonsense. Outside the Beltway, it looks like Washington as usual, right? The same old weird things that they do in order to get business done. But inside the Beltway, we know that this actually will provide time for the majority to get the bill to a place where they can get the support and get it through the Senate, back to the House and to the president's desk by the end of this week, which is what I think will happen.
Well, there's still a lot that needs to be done before that can happen, assuming that the majority leader, John Thune, or President Trump himself can twist the arms of enough Republicans to get it to pass in the Senate. It then has to pass in the House, Jeanne. And as we consider that, yes, the Senate did decide today to adopt the current policy baseline, formally take down at least the on-paper cost of this ultimate package, it's adding more to the deficit than the House bill would have. Is that really going to fly with the House Freedom Caucus?
It's going to be tough. I mean, ultimately, we have seen the Freedom Caucus members, putting Tom Massie aside, people like Chip Roy, they are very emotive and they are very passionate about their frustration with these bills. And ultimately, they have gone along with the leadership. But this vote coming up, presuming it gets through the Senate, is going to be unlike any of those, because this is it. In the past, Mike Johnson has been able to tell them, you'll get another pass at this, but this is it. And they've already indicated that the increase in the deficit that's coming over from the Senate side is unacceptable to them. So we have to wait and see. And, as we look at the Senate side, I would just say that the Vote-a-rama has already shown us that there is a break in this party structure here, as Democrats trying to protect rural hospitals got Collins and Murkowski to join them and to defect, which shows that on this issue of Medicaid cuts, surely the most controversial aspect of this for so many senators, that there is a break in support in the Senate. And that is going to continue to be a real point of contention for Republicans. And that's how the Democrats are using this Vote-a-rama effectively to not only force these votes, but to show Republicans that they are not unified. And we've seen that just in the last few minutes on the floor.
Reminding us that this is taking place before our eyes here, Jeanne. I just heard from a great source on Capitol Hill, Lisa Camooso Miller, that this Vote-a-rama may conclude with a Republican wraparound amendment that would revert many components of the Senate bill back to the House version, making this more palatable for the House to pass, knowing that there's not likely to be a conference committee here that would continue the process probably well beyond the president's deadline. You've seen this movie before. Is that how this ends? And why would senators vote for something that's still changing?
Well, it sure seems that way, Joe. And look, the way that this works is that the House and the Senate are working in real time together. As much as we talk about the negotiations in the Senate, the House is very much involved because they know that the bill will come back to them and this will have to get done. And also, don't forget that the power of the president will make phone calls. He will get involved when this process is in play and to get the House back together. So it seems to me like that kind of suggestion, that kind of wraparound to get things back to where it was so that they can make sure that the House can get this done quickly is certainly at play and very much something that would happen if the House and the Senate wanted to make sure that this bill was done by the end of this week, which is definitely the goal.
Well, I would point out that the White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt is currently holding a briefing as we speak, talking about this. She says that the president actually met this morning with both the House Speaker Mike Johnson and the Senate Majority Leader John Thune at the White House, and that Republicans need to stay tough and unify for this tax bill. To get back to this idea of a wraparound amendment, though, Jeanne, then what was the point of the entire exercise the Senate just went through for the last several weeks?
It's a good question, Kailey. This is the reality of how the Senate and the House operate, and the fact that they know how tough this vote is going to be. And people look at this and they think, well, this is really, really silly. But the reality for these members going home is that this bill continues to be wildly unpopular, whether it's a wraparound or not. You have the press secretary saying you've got to hang tough, you've got to be unified. If you vote no, the results will be catastrophic. That is what the message they're sending. But these members and senators also look in their own districts. And somebody like Lisa Murkowski, just a few days ago, the head of the legislature, the House and the Senate in Alaska, co-authored an editorial in the New York Times saying how devastating this bill will be for Alaska. So does Murkowski hold her nose and vote for it, particularly if it's on the wraparound? She might have to, but they know that this will impact them enormously as they go up for re-election and as they take this home. And of course, Donald Trump doesn't care. This is about you being supportive of him, regardless of the impact of the party. And we saw that with Tillis, because now Democrats could very well win a seat that he's held for three sessions.
Well, you wonder if the whale hunting caucus might save Lisa Murkowski's vote. As we discussed earlier, Jeanne, in this bill, a new provision upping the deduction that you can take for whale hunting related expenses covers boats and weapons as a charitable contribution. Reminding us that the leadership is keenly aware of who is at issue here when it comes to vote. Lisa, I don't know where we're going with this when it comes to a final vote on this bill. John Thune is, I'm sure, talking with people right now, but are the deals like these the deals that get this done, as opposed to the other amendments that are taking place in the light of day?
Well, yeah, this is how negotiation works in these processes, for sure. As I said, this is a great, big, diverse country, and each and every one of those U.S. senators that John Thune has to make satisfied with the way the bill comes together has also got to have something in there that works for their district, right? And so that's a lot of the way that this ends up getting done. You and we're all old enough to remember the Bridge to Nowhere. That was a long time ago, but it's another one of those moments in time when there was a back and forth that needed to happen within one of the senator's districts in order to make things happen on the economic side. So if this bill's going to pass, there's going to be a lot of give and take. There's going to be a lot of negotiation, and there's going to be a lot more to get done. But I guarantee you that this vote will happen by Wednesday of this week. I'm putting my $5 on it, Joe, and I'll bet you for it.
All right. You know, that bridge to nowhere was deemed, Kailey. That name came from Taxpayers for Common Sense. Their director, Steve Ellis, who was with us earlier, sent a letter to senators just a couple of days ago saying, relying on the current policy baseline gimmicks insults the intelligence of taxpayers. They will see through the tricks and spot the new debt piled on. You wonder if that's true.
Well, yeah, considering the committee, or rather the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, said that the Senate bill would add $3.3 trillion
That's right.
to the deficit over 10 years, more than the $2.8 trillion that would have been in the House package, which is why some of those fiscal conservatives in the House especially are having a difficult time with this. And we'll see if we end up with the wraparound solution we were just discussing with our political panel. Thank you so much to you both, Lisa Camooso Miller and Jeanne Zaino, joining us on this Monday with the Vote-a-rama still underway on the Senate floor. And Joe, no telling how much longer it will go on, but the expectation is hours and hours. We could still be at this when it turns from Monday to Tuesday.
Well, that's true. We could be talking about this tomorrow. There's no guarantee this happens tonight. And by the rate, at the rate we're going, this really could extend itself into the next calendar day here. We have a lot more to learn as we make our way forward. And we're going to talk about debt and deficit coming up with an interesting voice from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Marc Goldwein is going to join us coming up here live from Washington as we see if the math is mathing here on Bloomberg. Thanks for joining us here on the Monday edition on Bloomberg TV and radio as we feel our way through a day-long vote-a-rama in the U.S. Senate. This is the president's so-called big, beautiful bill. Senators are having their say now on any number of amendments that are being considered, which lines us up for a floor vote that could happen tonight. It could happen tomorrow morning. It's unclear. It depends how long this work will take. And that's where we start with Jack Fitzpatrick, Bloomberg government Congress reporter, with us live now in the throes of this process. Jack, it's great to have you with us. Your thoughts on timeline, but also the most important amendments we could be watching. We've got some dealing with Medicaid, others dealing with budget cuts that lawmakers are trying to have their final say on here. What's got your attention in this late hour?
Yeah, there's a lot of math to do on the hardline conservative side and on the more moderate centrist side. Some of the significant ones all have to do with Medicaid. There's a provision offered by Rick Scott that would reduce the federal cost share to Medicaid expansion states. That could be a fig leaf to conservative members who may be skeptical about supporting this bill. On the other end, Susan Collins has a really critical measure that would double from $25 billion to $50 billion the rural hospital fund that's meant to offset some of the lack of revenue from changes to the Medicaid provider tax. It would also increase the top tax bracket back to 39.6% for people making more than $25 million a year individually. So far, it's still a little bit hazy how many critical amendments there are going to be. Those are two important ones, but we still haven't even gotten to the actual amendments. They're doing procedural votes where Democrats offer measures to send it back to committee. So I wouldn't even say we're in the throes of it right now. They're still warming up, and we're well into the afternoon. So this is clearly going to be a very long vote-a-rama with critical votes from the moderates and the hardline conservatives.
Okay, so that may suggest more that this goes into Tuesday rather than wrapping up late tonight, Jack. When you mentioned the Collins amendment in particular, is there a sense that that could actually pick up or have enough Democratic support and enough Republican support to actually pass? I'm just trying to game out what the likelihood of any of these various scenarios being put forward actually becoming reality.
That is a tough one to say. We can't do a full whip count on all the Democrats right now. One of our colleagues caught Ron Wyden, the top member on the Finance Committee, top Democrat on the Finance Committee, who said he was interested in that Collins amendment. We don't know if it will quite get enough. And of course, it couldn't just be Collins and all of the Democrats. She'd have to get a couple other Republicans to join her. Maybe Lisa Murkowski could be that kind of member. It's certainly worth watching. partly because of the chance of it being adopted, potentially, or because Collins may end up voting against this. And if she does a good faith amendment to offer to improve it in a way that she likes, and she doesn't get that, that's potentially one more no vote that you can add to a couple other members who have a lot of complaints. So it's worth keeping in mind for the final whip count as well.
Jeff, what do you make of talk of a wraparound amendment at the end of this process? Something maybe authored by John Thune that would be brought forth by a Republican and revert many of these changes back to something closer to the House version. Is that likely? What would senators make of that as they prepare to vote?
That is a very complex question, and for a week or so, senators have openly acknowledged the possibility of a wraparound amendment that basically undoes some of the amendments they would have just voted to adopt. But the question is, how many of those amendments do they undo? Which of the amendments that are critical to the support of some of the skeptical Republicans do they undo, which is why I'm mentioning a couple amendments by Republicans and not just Democrats. And as you mentioned, how close does it get it back towards the House version, or is it very, very different from what the House passed and very much a Senate bill? So it is possible they will do a wraparound amendment. But as of now, the big question is, what changes do they work into a wraparound amendment, and which changes do they undo with that final or near final vote?
Would the end goal of that, what sounds like very convoluted and difficult process, be to lower the price tag ultimately of this bill so that it's easier for the House to tolerate it and not have to go to conference committee, Jack?
I would think just logically the purpose of a wraparound amendment toward the end would be to undo things that Republican leaders see as Democratic shenanigans that may have gotten enough Republican support to be adopted, rather than cutting down on the cost. As we've watched this get closer to the floor, we've seen little measures trying to get support from holdouts, some Alaska-specific things for Lisa Murkowski, for example, that have increased the cost. It seems that giving little giveaways to key members is a bigger priority to getting this across the floor than reducing the overall cost. So if you're a real hardliner on that, that's probably not good news.
All right, Jack Fitzpatrick of Bloomberg Government live on Capitol Hill for us. Thank you so much. And certainly, as we consider the cost of this bill, that's something that Democrats are latching onto and running with, as several Democratic senators have warned about the package's impact on the deficit.
If the bill and the cuts included in the bill indeed reduce the deficit, as they claim it does, they wouldn't have needed to raise the debt limit in the process.
It also drives $4 trillion in debt. It used to be 3.4. Now it's up to $4 trillion.
We know what the math is. Everybody in this room knows the deficit is far worse today than it was when Donald Trump passed those tax cuts.
I don't want to hear any more from my colleagues about deficits. I don't want to hear any more crocodile tears about deficits. We're mortgaging our future.
And this is what we turn to now with Marc Goldwein, Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which has been out with warning after warning over the cost and deficit impact of this package. Marc, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We know one of the first things the Senate did today was vote to adopt the current policy baseline, effectively saying, at least on paper, this doesn't cost the trillions of dollars that the Congressional Budget Office has estimated. Give us a reality check.
Yeah, that, at least on paper, is really important because the bond markets aren't going to see it that way. This bill, as written, adds about $4 trillion to the debt. It includes a lot of gimmicky expirations. If you were to make it all permanent, adds about $5.5 trillion of debt. And they're trying to use some sort of legal shenanigans where basically the chairman of the Budget Committee says, I'm going to pretend that it reduces the deficit. And it's just not grounded in reality.
Current policy baseline. Maybe the most important thing, the most important vote that happened today, Marc, Republican senators voting in favor of this accounting method to continue what was basically started here in the House, which essentially means that extending the Trump tax cuts costs nothing. How does that math work?
Yeah. So it's even worse than that. So they are pretending the Trump tax cuts had already been extended, right? And so that basically gives them a free $3.8 trillion they don't have to charge themselves with. But they aren't pretending that everything's permanent. All of the new temporary tax cuts and spending in the bill, they are counting as temporary. So it's not even a pure, we're just going to assume everything's permanent baseline. It's a mix and match baseline to get their best desired number. And as I said, that might work for, the sales pitch and for the signs they want to hold up. But the bond markets aren't going to see it that way when we have deficits approaching 7-8% of GDP and debt that is zooming past World War II levels.
Okay, so let's consider some of the various solves for at least part of this math problem that senators are putting forward. Like, for example, Mark, the amendment that Senator Rick Scott is pursuing, which would end the federal or phase out federal cost sharing for Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. How much money would something like that really save? How far would that go into eating into the cost of this bill?
Sure. So they have about a $4 trillion hole. Senator Scott's amendment, which is actually pretty significant, would close about 10% of that. With interest, with about $400 billion. That'd be a pretty good start, but you still have the other 90% to go. This bill is past the point that you can sort of tinker with the Medicaid and SNAP and other changes and fix it. They really need to go back to the drawing board and make some major changes. And by the way, I should add, this bill's $1 trillion more expensive than the House. So even to get back to the House's number, they have to make major changes.
That's exactly what the Freedom Caucus was saying. The House Freedom Caucus out with a statement late yesterday saying it adds $1.3 trillion to the deficit that the House budget didn't have, 1,705% more than the House bill. You probably have heard talk about this wraparound amendment that might end the Vote-a-rama here. Marc, it would revert this bill back to something closer to the House version. Makes it pretty difficult to come up with any estimates or projections here on what the real cost would be, isn't it?
We're doing our best to do the Insta estimates, but look, the House bill added about $3 trillion to the debt. This adds about $4 trillion to the debt. We should be reducing the debt by $8 trillion. I would much rather have the House one than the Senate one, but let's not pretend that either of these are fiscally responsible.
Well, of course, part of the Republicans' argument and part of the administration's argument, Mark, is that it's one thing to consider what the Congressional Budget Office can actually score, although they have qualms with that for not taking into account potential growth impacts to the extent that they would like. But the other is that there are certain things the Congressional Budget Office is not able to score, like, for example, the president's tariffs that are in place and bringing revenue into the Treasury. If we were to factor that in, what does the ultimate picture of these policies in aggregate actually look like?
Yeah, it's a fair point. So we've looked at the president's tariffs. If they were all to stay in effect as they are today, that means no new trade deals, no exemptions, no nothing. They would cover about half of the cost of this bill on a yearly basis. It's a head start. But remember, large parts of the president's tariff have actually been ruled illegal by the U.S. Trade Court. They're still in effect pending appeal. But if those end up going away, it only covers about 15 to 20% of this bill. So yes, tariffs raise revenue, but again, they're not going to cover the cost.
Well, and of course, we could have a bunch of trade deals announced. Marc, that's what the administration tells us as we get closer to July 9th. Howard Lutnick told Kailey and I just a couple of days ago, expect about 10 trade deals between now and then. That takes money away from this, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, it depends what the trade deals are relative to, right? Because I wasn't giving you the Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs that they pulled because they were so damaging to the markets. But the tariff revenue could be way down. And on economic growth, the Congressional Budget Office actually looked at this, not with the Senate bill yet, but with the House bill. They found that economic effects makes it more costly. The reason is, lower taxes boost the economy, but higher debt also boosts interest rates. And because we have so much debt already, higher interest rates mean higher interest payments. Actually means the dynamic score adds more to the debt than what they call static scoring.
Well, and it's those interest payments that President Trump seems specifically focused on with his repeated criticism, and not just the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, but today widening it out to the entire Fed board, which he argues is just sitting by while rates stay high. He actually sent a note to the Fed chair with world central bank rates showing where he thinks the U.S. should be, somewhere in the ballpark of 25 to 175 basis points versus where we are now at 4.5%. Marc, does he actually, though, have a point about how the U.S. might be a fiscal, survival health necessity for interest rates to go lower because of this burden?
Well, last time the Fed cut rates in the short term, we actually saw the 10-year go up. So last year, remember, the Fed cut rates by about a full percentage point in total, and the 10-year Treasury went from 3.5 to 4.5. So cutting the near-term rate isn't a guarantee that the long term is going to go down. If the underlying sort of deficit, inflation, debt market dynamics aren't feeling it. So, maybe the Fed cutting rates is going to help us, but it's not clear it's going to help us very much, and it could reignite inflation in the process.
Marc, it's great to have you with us. Marc Goldwein, Senior Policy Director, I should say, at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Thanks for crunching the numbers for us. I'm not sure any single person has read this entire bill, Kailey, 940 pages. Although Senate clerks divvied it up yesterday, it took them 16 hours starting late Saturday night into Sunday to read the big, beautiful bill.
Could you imagine being on air for 16 hours?
No.
We just got a few. We have another coming up at 5 p.m.
Don't give them any ideas.
We'll see you then on Bloomberg.
And make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. It won't take you 16 hours. Go to Apple, Spotify, or wherever you do your podcasts and find Balance of Power. Listen anytime at Bloomberg.com.